T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff of the Falcon 9, stage 1. Pitch kick. Falcon 9 has cleared the tower.
Stage 2 MVAC engine chilling in. First 2 M9 engine shut down. First stage MECO 2. First stage engine shut down.
Second stage has separated.
Inertial velocity at MECO was approximately
MVAC ignition confirmed.
3.2 kilometers per second. Nominal.
Hi. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Chairman's Forum. Thanks for coming to Stimson on a rainy day. I'm Link Bloomfield. Maybe somewhere in the outer galaxies there's intelligent life that knows how to come into our orbit and then safely land on the surface of the Earth. But in all of human history, only one human being has ever done this without a government sort of leading the way, and he's sitting next to me. So welcome, Elon Musk.
Thank you.
It's an honor. one of America's real pioneers and entrepreneurs. Here at Stimson, we talk a lot about policy. We talk about governments. We come from, some of us are old enough to come from a 20th century mentality that governments seem to set policy. But in the 21st century, we're realizing that non-governmental actors often are out in front, changing things. And as we'll hear, I'm going to give a little bit of your background before we start to talk about space. You've actually changed things in the way we use the internet. You're changing the game in space. You're changing the way we use energy. And all of those are things that Washington people find themselves chasing the policy implications. And so to have an innovator entrepreneur, I think, fits right into the theme of Chairman's Forum. So again, we're honored to have you. Thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I know that you made an important announcement an hour ago, and I'm going to get to that. But first, let me just introduce our guest. Mr. Elon Musk was born and raised in South Africa, came to Canada as a teenager, and then came to the United States, where he is a U.S. citizen. As a youth computer programmer, at the age of 12, created and sold the software for a space game and made a little money off of it. So, and then just to quickly touch on the other innovations, a company called Zip2, which created online content publishing software for news organizations. You co-founded X.com, which became PayPal, secure e-commerce logic, which of course is used everywhere now. In 2002, founded Space Exploration Technologies, known as SpaceX. You're not only the CEO, but the Chief Technology Officer, which is, I think, very interesting. We'll talk about the line of rockets. We knew about the Falcon 1 and the Falcon 9. We're going to hear a little bit more in a moment. And then in 2004, founded Tesla Motors, the co-founder, chairman, and CEO, the electric vehicle company in California, and is also chairman of Solar City, a photovoltaic products and services company started in 2006. So you see some themes here: internet, video games, e-commerce, energy efficiency technologies, and space. And so before we talk about the announcement, I'm curious, what was it that captured your imagination as a young person about space? What did space mean to you?
Well, when I was very young, space just seemed really cool. But it was I didn't expect to be involved in space when I was young. But when I was in college, I decided I wanted to be involved in things that I thought would have a significant impact on the future of humanity. And the three things that I could come up with were the internet, sustainable energy, both production and consumption, and space exploration, but particularly the extension of life beyond Earth to multiple planets. And as it turns out, I've been fortunate enough to get involved in all three of those areas.
Well, that's quite interesting. So there's a geographic reach to your interest in space. Right now, you're involved in sort of doing contract activities. We can talk about that with the space station and whatnot. But you see a future vision. Do you think that the United States or even private sector entities will be accessing outer space at some point in the future? And how far are we from that vision?
Yeah, I think in order to, in order for humanity to become a true spacefaring civilization and ultimately become a multi-planet species, I think we have to harness the power of free enterprise, because otherwise it will simply be unaffordable. It's important to appreciate that there is a very fundamental cost barrier to life becoming multiplanetary. And if you don't mind me exploring that issue a little bit, because if you break it down and first say, well, why is it important that life become multiplanetary? If you look at the nature of importance itself and use the lens of history as a guide, and generally the lens of history, the further you zoom out, the more the important milestones remain and the less important ones disappear. Things that may seem important in the moment, if you think about them, are not going to be really important in the long term. but on the grander scale, on the evolution of life itself, you can look at the major milestones and say that there's the advent of single-celled life, multicellular life, differentiation to plants and animals, life going from the oceans to land, mammals, consciousness. Those are kind of the big ones. But I think also on that scale would fit life becoming multiplanetary. That would be at least comparable to life going from the oceans to land. And if there's something that fits, that is important enough to arguably fit on the scale of the evolution of life itself, it's fair to say that it should be considered important, and deserves some small portion of our resources to accomplish. And I'm not talking about a huge portion, but perhaps we can bound it quite easily by saying it should be much less than what we spend on healthcare, but more than what we spend on lipstick. And I like lipstick. Lipstick's very important. Maybe it's sort of a 0.2 or 0.3% of our GDP, something like that is warranted. And I do think that we should not delay this action, because this is the first time in the 4 billion year history of Earth that it's been possible at all for life to extend beyond Earth, and it's possible just barely for humanity to create a self-sustaining civilization on Mars. Extraordinarily difficult, but possible. It is hard to say how long that window will be open. That window could be open for a long time, or it could be open for a short time. But I think that the wise thing to do is to not assume it will be open for a long time, and to take action to make life multiplanetary while we can.
Well, people who have had a similar aspiration and a vision, an attachment to the vision of space and the continuum of human and planetary evolution, have generally joined into sort of governmental efforts until this point, because that's where the action was. Would you, if someone were sitting in this audience, a young person who shares a similar aspiration, my expectation is they might think, well, can I get a job at NASA, or can I work for the Air Force? You went to business. You're a businessman. You've had an MBA, Wharton School.
Actually, don't have an MBA. I have a dual undergraduate in physics and economics.
Physics and economics. Well, I think you've, in so many ways, demonstrated the MBA capability. And the question is, that wouldn't appear to have been something you would naturally do. Do you think that private sector is on a par with the government in their capacity to aspire to these kind of accomplishments, or where does the government and non-government come together? Which
Sure.
one has the more? Why would you invest in one more than the other?
Well, I think I think government plays an important role in funding things that have a small amount of benefit to a large portion of the population. Sort of basic science, the frontiers of exploration, that kind of thing, where there's not an obvious direct economic feedback loop. But it's nonetheless an important thing to do that's helpful to everyone, like the Hubble, for example. That we gained a lot of knowledge and understanding of the universe from the Hubble. It didn't necessarily translate to specific economics for one particular company, so it made sense that would be funded by the government. But funded by the government just means funded by the people. Government, by the way, has no money. It only takes money from the people. So sometimes people forget that's really what occurs. So when there is a benefit that accrues to the people as a whole, then it's fair that the money should be drawn from the people as a whole to match that benefit. But government is inherently inefficient, and so it makes sense to minimize the role of government and such that government does only what it has to do and no more. There's obviously very clear examples of this in comparing something like East and West Germany or North and South Korea, or places where you have essentially the same people but two different systems of government. and East and West Germany, for example, the economic output per capita was about five times higher in West Germany, arguably more than 5 times, but at least 5 times higher in West Germany than East. And it's not as though West Germany was particularly capitalist. I mean, they're sort of a lot more socialist than we are, and yet they had that huge output difference. Or North and South Korea is an even more stark example,
Sure.
where North Korea people undergo starvation. South Korea is incredibly prosperous, and so you want to always watch that dial, that allocation of resources dial, and make sure that government doesn't become too large a portion of the economy.
Well, in the space sector, if we look back in going back to the 60s, if you will, where NASA was in its heyday, we put a man on the moon in 1969. A lot of studies in Washington have talked about how the space industrial base is shrinking in the United States, how we've sort of losing our lead in space. After certain events in the 90s involving U.S. companies in China, there was more restrictive export controls on satellites, commercial satellites, which remain, I believe, under review in the White House, as they were under the previous administration, but restrictive. And so there's an international space industry. Do you have a view on whether the industrial base, are we shrinking? Is America's lead shrinking in your view, and where does your activity fit into that picture?
Well, it's certainly true that over the past few decades, America's lead has really, well, it went away like 20 years ago, and returned last year, thanks to SpaceX. In the 80s, America used to do almost all of the commercial launches, and then with the fall of the Soviet Union, and they actually ended up sort of in a lot of ways becoming more capitalist than we were, and then between Europe and Russia, to a less degree, China and India, they absorbed almost the entire commercial launch market. There are a lot of commercial satellites launched every year. There are more commercial satellites launched every year than there are U.S. government satellites, by at least a factor of 2 or 3. And yet the United States has share of that market has been sort of negligible to zero. But last year, the United States won more launch contracts, commercial launch contracts, than any other country, due almost entirely to SpaceX. Now, there's a lead time of anywhere from 2 to 4 years between when you win the contract and when you do the launch. So in about sort of 2 to 4 years, we'll be doing more commercial launches than any other country. But I think that's because at SpaceX we're really harnessing the power of American free enterprise, which is the most competitive system in the world, and applying kind of a mode of operation that is sort of closer to Silicon Valley, I think, than sort of typical government contractors.
So in economic terms, who are the sort of bigger users looking forward a few years? Is it commercial use of space? Is it government and military use, or scientific use? Where's the market looking forward in the near to mid-term?
Well, like I said, there are actually more commercial launches even today than there are U.S. government launches. And I expect that as we are able to lower the cost of access to space, which we're doing in a very significant way, that there will be more commercial satellite business plans that work than was previously the case. So we'll see some market expansion occur. So I would expect that the percentage of space activity that is commercial will increase over time. Government will still play a very important role, particularly for missions, like I said earlier, that have a small amount of benefit to a large number of people, but where there isn't a direct economic feedback loop. So government will still play a very important role, also in pushing the frontier of exploration. But in terms of market size, I would expect the commercial market to actually increase on a percentage basis.
You've just come from an announcement. We knew about the Falcon 1 rocket. The Falcon 9 was just depicted in the film. Can you tell us what's coming next?
Yeah, so the big announcement we just made today was for our Falcon Heavy launch vehicle, which is it's going to be the most capable vehicle of any kind on Earth. It'll put more than twice the payload capability of the space shuttle into orbit, and has twice the thrust of the biggest Russian rocket and the biggest U.S. rocket. So twice as big as the Russian Proton and the Boeing Lockheed Delta IV Heavy. So it's really quite an epic vehicle. In fact, it'll have more payload to orbit than any rocket apart from the Saturn V moon rocket.
And what kind of a payload do you expect to be launched off of this vehicle? I mean, what are the potential uses?
There's a wide range of potential uses. Certainly, Falcon Heavy can launch the largest government and commercial satellites with ease. In fact, you could arguably do two of the largest satellites at a time.
Is that conceivable technologically?
Oh yeah. Well, we expect this to be on the launch pad at a launch pad at Vandenberg Air Force Base next year, and then launched probably in 2013. So this is not speculative or.
But could you deploy 2 satellites with one launch?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely, no problem. Yeah. Oh. We can deploy. Well, in fact, we have the launch contract to do the next generation Iridium constellation, where we'll be doing 8 or 9 satellites per flight.
Per flight.
Yeah.
Well, you're the chief technology officer. I'm curious because I have a bit of a background in export controls, and wish I had known a lot more about the fine details. How sensitive is the information that your engineers have when they marry a bus to a rocket launch, a payload to a launch vehicle? How much do they need to know about what's on the bus in order to make sure that they don't destroy it or that they deploy it properly? Is it highly sensitive information?
Well, I think it's simply providing enough information to know how to integrate the satellite onto the rocket. I don't think that necessarily reveals anything particularly proprietary. However, certain countries have a track record of absconding with intellectual property, and so I think it's perhaps not a good idea to put them in close proximity to anything that's any advanced U.S. space technology.
So there needs to be, I mean, the export control regime looks at the nationalities of the workers, their access to certain work areas,
right.
There are monitors often, and so after the Space Shuttle Endeavour takes its mission at the end of this month, there'll be no more Space Shuttle. Your company will be the cargo delivery vehicle to the International Space Station, if I'm not mistaken. You'll do 12 resupply missions.
Yes.
And so that's been somewhat privatized. I mean, does the U.S., from a policy standpoint, need to worry a little bit about whether it has, and whether it can control its technology and still get it launched reliably?
Well, I think I wouldn't worry about U.S. satellites being launched on any vehicles except maybe China is a bit dodgy. That's really, I think, the only meaningful concern. I've not really seen the Russians try to steal U.S. rocket technology, and actually that's because at least until SpaceX, their rocket technology has been better than ours. So I'm not sure exactly what they would steal. In fact, the Boeing and Lockheed's Atlas V vehicle uses a Russian main engine, and they've not yet figured out how to make that engine themselves. So, so the Russians are obviously not too worried about that. With the advent of SpaceX and our Falcon family of rockets, there's now for the first time in a long time a vehicle that is better than the Russians. So we would certainly be cautious about exposing our technology to the Russians, but there's little danger of that.
If your engineers in California can come up with a bigger and better launch vehicle, are there other entities around the world who could be doing the same thing and doing it within a cost sort of level that competes as well with SpaceX and with others? Is this a one-off or a unique situation, or might there be a new baseline, if you will, of competitive launch technologies emerging?
I'm not aware of anything that has the potential to beat our technology. As far as I can tell, we're better than anything else that's exists or anything else that's under development by a significant margin. There could be some secret development that I'm not aware of, or there could be some organization that starts up that's new, but at least I'm not aware of anything that poses a threat to SpaceX, particularly given that our rate of evolution of our technology is very fast. I mean, in Silicon Valley, you're sort of very used to this mentality of you innovate fast or die. And if you think of the national champions or international champions that have grown out of Silicon Valley, of the Google, Facebook, Intel, Cisco, Apple, who are their international competitors? Yeah. Can you name one?
No.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, I mean that's a different language than in this town. It's you innovate fast and die.
Right.
So there's a bit of a cultural difference here.
Right.
You've got your operations are just outside of Los Angeles. Roughly, I mean, how big is the workforce at SpaceX?
We're just under 1,300 people.
1,300. And where do you find space-capable engineers? How do you grow a space company in America?
Well, so I was in Silicon Valley for 10 years before moving down to LA to start SpaceX. And the reason I did it in Southern California was because Southern California has the biggest concentration of space engineers in the world.
Who have been laid off, or who are moving from one thing to another? Or?
SpaceX it hires at the sort of the top 2 or 3% of the space profession. So I think of SpaceX like special, like you have regular army, and then there's like the special forces.
Special operations.
SpaceX is special forces.
I see.
So it's possible they would hire someone who is laid off if they're laid off for reasons of seniority and not merit, but not otherwise.
I mean, it's curious to me. It strikes one as a high-risk profession. I mean, if a rocket goes awry, we've seen films of sort of Chinese launches in the past and others. And while they make fascinating viewing, they're probably highly expensive. They make insurance companies very nervous. Is it high risk to have a rocket company? I mean, do you test launch things and let them blow up just to find things out? Or?
No, we don't. We never intentionally blow up a rocket.
Or does it all just come down to one vehicle and it's supposed to work and hope it does?
We always aim for success, and we've been fortunate in that our last 4 missions have been four consecutive successes, and particularly the last one was particularly complex because it was a test of our Falcon 9 launch vehicle and our Dragon spacecraft, which orbited the Earth a couple times and then touched down just off the coast of California, which is the first time that a private company has brought something back from orbit, that's tough. There's only sort of half a dozen nations that have achieved that. That's
right. Well, that's where we began. I want to just mention the military side of space and get your view on this. A lot of work is done in the Pentagon, in the Congress, in the executive branch, and there's been doctrinal development that says space is a domain. We have security interest in space. Our economy is tied to space. Our ability to conduct military operations is integrally tied to space. There's no going back. And so some will say space must be defended. It must be protected. There's a lot of effort that is not irreversible, but it's to prepare for contingencies in which we are threatened in space. And I guess my question is, as a private sector space player, do you have a view on what's happening with the military reliance on space and sort of the substantial effort that's put into it in Washington? Is that something SpaceX would potentially contribute to, the Air Force effort?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly see launching of Air Force and NRO type satellites as an important part of our future business. We don't have any Air Force NRO launch contracts yet, but I'm very optimistic that we will soon have such contracts. they're just a very, very conservative organization. But now that we've had 2 successes with our Falcon 9 vehicle, and now that we're coming out with Falcon Heavy, and Falcon Heavy, since Falcon Heavy is twice as powerful as anything the Air Force currently has access to, it allows them to launch bigger satellites or potentially do multiple satellites on a single flight. And then as far as civil space missions, in terms of sending probes to outer planets, perhaps doing something like a Mars sample return, these are really enabled by our Falcon Heavy capability, since it's a capability the world doesn't have yet, and it hasn't had since Saturn V.
So it's both the civil and potentially military or intelligence use.
Yes, it's exactly civil, military, and commercial. I think it's really going to open up a world of possibilities in all of those arenas.
Well, one of the things that military planners talk about is sort of the worst case in which assets are either being degraded or denied, or in the worst case destroyed, which can obviously create debris in orbit with very long-term consequences. And they talk about the ability to reconstitute a capability very quickly in these fast-moving crises. If you have a launch vehicle that could potentially put several assets up quickly, I mean, is that something that you would look at from a SpaceX perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at SpaceX, I think, we're very supportive of national security goals as well as civil space and commercial goals. I think in terms of sort of anti-satellite capability, I think we really need to pay closer attention to having defense systems on the satellite, just basically being able to dodge missiles. It's because I think you can build ground-based anti-satellite missiles a lot faster than you can launch satellites. So just replacing them fast is not going to really do the trick. You really need to have satellites up there that can effectively dodge incoming missiles.
Well, I'm a little concerned about laser beams, which can be turned on very short notice.
Yeah, but there's a solution to that too, which is to have a powerful heat shield. That's something that can, because I agree, you need to deal with missiles as well as directed energy weapons. Mm-hmm. It's a little harder to do the directed energy weapon technology. I'm not sure that other countries have that yet. They probably will at some point in the future. But it's much easier to just have some sort of kinetic interceptor. But like I said, I think you can, if you have a satellite with a powerful heat shield, that can be a good defense against sort of a laser or something like that. In fact, our Dragon spacecraft has a powerful heat shield for re-entering, where it's got to resist tremendous heat to prevent getting vaporized on re-entry. So that's something we've suggested to the Defense Department that could be interesting technology in defending against anti-satellite weapons.
It seems like the Pentagon has, because of the decline of the U.S. space sector, which you sort of marked at a very low point, even starting 20 years ago, now suggests the possibility there could be more of a competitive space sector back in the United States. Do you agree with that? And do you think that competition can be increased to provide solutions like more resilient satellites, or to sort of have a technological race, if you will, to solve problems, as opposed to the sole source methodology?
Yeah, well, I think competition is always a good thing. And now, the U.S. has actually done, relatively speaking, much better in the satellite, competing in terms of satellite market than in the launch market. So the U.S. Actually does have a dominant share, or at least a substantial share, in the commercial satellite market with Loral Space Systems in Silicon Valley and Boeing Space Satellites, which used to be Hughes in Southern California, Orbital Sciences here in Virginia. So the U.S. has done reasonably well on the commercial satellite front, and it does very well in the defense satellite side of things. But I think you always need to look at this as a constantly evolving market where European, Chinese, and other satellite makers certainly want to take that market share away from American companies.
We've been talking about what the U.S. can do, and some of it on a sensitive, unilateral kind of basis. But do you have a view as to what the future could hold in terms of international space cooperation? Because certainly the national space policy, NASA's mission are very much geared to international cooperation, peaceful cooperation in space. How does a private entity that specializes in launch services, what do you see as the road ahead in terms of potential involvement with non-U.S. players in space?
Do you mean in civil space missions? It's sort of like science missions and that kind of thing?
Or governmental, even manned space missions. I mean, if there were a failure of a national program and they saw an opportunity they could afford to use your launch service.
Sure.
I mean, I'm just making this up, but
yeah, no, I think I think SpaceX will probably in about 3 years or so be carrying astronauts to the space station. I mean, as you mentioned a moment ago, the space shuttle retires this year. SpaceX takes over from the space shuttle as far as the cargo transport to and from the space station. But on an interim basis, the Russian Soyuz will carry American astronauts to the space station until we're ready to take over. But I think at that point, I think SpaceX will take both American astronauts, astronauts from other countries, and as well as private individuals to space.
it's very interesting. I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to ask you questions, but before we turn to those questions, I hope you don't mind if I turn to energy efficiency, because
sure.
you've got a lot of people driving electric vehicles, and probably more to come. Can I ask you sort of what your view is on energy, and is there a purpose, a mission behind the Tesla motors, which people sometimes focus on the sports car and what fun it is, and I've driven it, and I agree it's fun, but is there a larger sort of view that you're trying to change policy and change societal behavior on energy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was in college I thought there were sort of three areas that most affect the future of humanity: the internet, sustainable energy, both production and consumption, and then space. So what Tesla's about is trying to help solve the consumption of energy problem. So I mean, tautologically, we must have sustainable consumption of energy in production, because if it's unsustainable, well, it's unsustainable. In fact, even if there were no negative environmental consequences to the use of fossil fuels, and even if there were no national security consequences, let's say we owned all the oil and it had no negative impact on the environment, it's still finite. We must still find a solution, or we will face economic collapse when the resources become scarce. So obviously we must find alternatives. I believe in electric transport because it allows for energy to be produced in a wide range of sustainable means, and then you just charge the car. Electricity is sort of like cash. I mean, it's sort of, you can generate it in multiple ways, you can spend it in multiple ways. So electric vehicles is something that is a long-term sustainable option, and it is fundamentally very energy efficient to use electric vehicles. In fact, although our Tesla Roadster is a fast sports car, better acceleration than almost any other sports car, it uses less energy per mile than a Prius. In fact, the battery pack only has the equivalent of 2 gallons of gasoline worth of energy. And even if you take power from a coal power plant, so it's entirely coal, and you take into account transmission losses and charging losses and so forth, and say how much CO2 to generate per mile, it's still less than a Prius. Because stationary power plants are actually quite energy efficient. So the point of Tesla was to make a viable electric car that kind of broke the paradigm of what people thought of as an electric car, because people used to think of electric cars as these sort of ugly, slow-moving golf carts. And so by making a sports car that was aesthetically pleasing, very fast, great handling, long range, as much range as you get from a gas tank, that really helped break people's perception of what an electric car could be. And it had a powerful catalytic effect in that when Bob Lutz, General Motors, saw the announcement about the Tesla Roadster, he took the press release, went down to his development team and said, if a small company in California can do it, so can we. And that's what generated the GM Volt, and in turn the Nissan Leaf and Daimler's movement in electric vehicles. And because at the time they used to be the world's largest car company. So when the world's largest car company announces they're going to go do an electric program, the others tend to follow. So I think it's had a good effect in that direction. Of course, we need to keep up the momentum, and so Tesla is coming out with the sort of step 2, which is a mid-price, mid-volume car that really shows what is possible when you design the whole car as a system around electric powertrain, and just how much more compelling it can be than a gasoline car. I think people will be quite pleasantly surprised by the Model S that's coming out next year.
And there's a longer-term vision of a third vehicle?
Yes. So the simple sort of three-step strategy of Tesla was come out with a high-price car at low volume, mid-price car at mid-volume, low-price car at high volume. Mm-hmm. Kind of 3 major technology iterations, and stepping up production volume by an order of magnitude in each case, which is damn fast for a small company to grow at that rate.
Well, I should just say I saw a news clip last week that a major Wall Street bank predicted that Tesla Motors will become the 4th American major automobile company after GM, Ford, and Chrysler. So that's pretty amazing. I do want to ask you, as a technology person, about battery storage.
Sure.
Because the question is, batteries can do what they can do today. How fast is the power density improving in whether the lithium chemistries or alternative? The military is looking at battery-based energy efficiency in both the operational theater but also in facilities. They're a big consumer of energy, as you know. Yeah. And lithium-ion is expensive. It's lightweight, but it's expensive. And so the question is, how fast is this moving? And how fast can we expect leaps and bounds in battery storage?
Well, it's moving pretty fast. I mean, if you look at the Tesla Roadster, that has a 56 kilowatt-hour battery pack. The Model S will have a 90 kilowatt-hour battery pack in about the same volume, and with a dramatically lower cost per kilowatt-hour. So the Model S, despite being a good-sized sedan, that's about the external dimensions roughly that of a 5 Series BMW or an E-Class Mercedes, will do 300 miles of range on a single charge, versus the Roadster, which is 245 miles, and a much smaller car. So the Model S is 50% bigger than heavier than the Roadster, and yet does more than 20% greater range, and costs much less than the Roadster. So
can I just ask whether the tragic events in Japan have impacted the supply of batteries from global supply?
We had about a 1 week or so supply interruption, but we had sufficient buffer inventory on hand that it did not change our production at all.
I see. Well, with that, are you ready to face the crowd?
Sure.
I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Would you please identify yourself and state your question clearly? Thank you.
Bill Pelton, as the founder of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation, 1983.
Here we go.
I'd like to congratulate you on receiving the Innovators Award this evening.
Oh, thank you.
Intelsat.
I'm honored to receive it. Thank you.
Just 2 quick questions, if I could. One, of the Moon versus Mars in terms of a colony, and also the issue of sustainability of space and space debris. What thoughts do you have about avoiding the Kessler syndrome and so on?
Sure. Well, the reason I favor Mars over the Moon is that Mars has really got the potential for a true planet-class civilization because it's a planet. The moon is not a planet. The moon is much smaller. It's much weaker in terms of natural resources. It's harder for us to adapt to it because it's got a much lower gravity. The day-night cycle is 28 days. So you really effectively have a fairly small habitable zone near the poles of the moon, and water ice is very, very rare there. So I think I consider the moon to be kind of analogous to the Arctic. So the Arctic was very close to Europe, but it sucked. That's why America isn't there. But Mars is a real planet, and we can create become a true multiplanetary civilization on Mars, which I don't think is realistic on the Moon. And it also, when one thinks of preserving the future of life as we know it, Mars is sufficiently far away that if something terrible happened to Earth, it would probably be would not be affected. The Moon might still be affected, so that's the reason I favor Mars. In terms of orbital debris, I think there's a certain zone which is called, I'd say it's sort of the medium Earth orbit altitudes, where orbital debris is long term becomes a problem. It's not a problem today, but long term it becomes a problem. In low Earth orbit, the atmosphere is still there to a certain degree, and actually ends up being like a cleaning. It'll sweep out orbital debris and eventually bring it back in and slow down and re-enter and burn up. So there's not really a low Earth orbit debris problem. And if you go out to geosynchronous orbit, that's just so freaking far out there that it's really, you don't have to worry about it there either. So it's kind of just in that medium zone, that's sort of the maybe 800 to a few thousand miles type of orbit that we need to pay attention to. But I do think it's something that's only really a very long-term problem. It's not something we need to worry about in the short to medium term.
Another question, sir. One moment, wait for the mic.
Bill Sweetman, Defense Technology International magazine. You talk about needing to continue innovating fast. With SpaceX, beyond Falcon 9 Heavy, which is extension of the original architecture, what directions are you going to take that in? Are you going to go further into reusability? What do you think that the space exploration needs as the next phases of innovation from SpaceX?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in reusability, and that remains a fundamental long-term objective of SpaceX. In fact, a fully reusable rocket system, I think, is it's a pivotal fundamental invention necessary to make life multiplanetary. I do not think it will occur in the absence of a fully reusable system. And the reason for that is, if you look at the cost of propellant on a Falcon 9, it's maybe $150,000, maybe $200,000 at most. But the cost of the vehicle is $50 million. So when you've got the cost of propellant at kind of 0.3% of the cost of a flight, then clearly there's a lot of efficiencies to be had if you can use that rocket more than once. And it's no different than air flight. A Boeing 747 costs maybe $250 million. You'd need two of them for a round trip. So why doesn't your air ticket cost $500 million? It's because they can use that plane thousands of times. So it's incredibly fundamental to have a reusable system. And going back to the sort of founding of America, if ships had not been reusable in the days of the Mayflower, the United States would not exist. Nobody could afford the journey. And they might have sent a few people as an exploratory thing. And of course, since ships would be expendable, you need to tow your return ship behind you. So so they might have said, oh, yes, it turns out there is a continent out there, but of course we can't afford to go there because it costs 2 ships every time we make the return journey. But in fact, ships can be used repeatedly, airplanes can be used repeatedly. In fact, every mode of transport can be used repeatedly. And if that were not the case, we would not use that mode of transport, whether it's plane, train, automobile, bicycle, or whatever. I think we can establish a self-sustaining civilization on Mars for probably something like 0.3% of our GDP, but I don't think we're willing to spend 100% of our GDP on it. And that's the difference between reusability and non-reusability. So it remains a fundamental goal of SpaceX.
I'm in the front row.
Andrea Maleta with Futron. You made some really interesting comments about some of the protective systems. You talked about the heat shields on the Dragon and so on. Can we see the possibility that you would take some of that technology and some of those innovations to apply to the spacecraft manufacturing world, where there's a lot of interest both in terms of military satellites and commercial satellites in having awareness and protection on that? Can we see you moving in that area?
Yeah, and well, I think with our sort of Dragon Lab program, which we're starting to see a fair bit of interest in, which is to take the Dragon spacecraft that will be used for space station servicing and adapting that to commercial and other government applications. I think you'll start to see a fair bit of that happening. So certainly that's an area of interest to us. Well, Dragon is kind of like, Dragon is basically a sophisticated satellite. It's actually more sophisticated than most satellites, I'd say, because it's got multiple redundant systems. It's got the ability to dock with another, dock with the space station or dock with anything, and re-enter. And actually, Dragon can be reused. We recovered Dragon, and we're actually able to fire Dragon's engines, no problem. The heat shield could take several re-entry events. So even the first Dragon that we recovered in December from orbit could be flown many times. So it's a step in the direction of reusability.
Questions, sir?
Hi, Justin Manger with Sojitz Corporation. I was just wondering if you're worried as the SpaceX and Tesla grow. You talk about innovation all the time. Google's now, some people say, having trouble innovating and want to stay young, have that startup feel. Are you running into that problem, or do you think you will as you grow?
That's what we call a high-class problem.
Right, it is the high-class problem. I actually think our rate of innovation is increasing. We're doing more things faster. We also have a lot more employees, so there's another question as to whether our productivity per person is increasing. I do think it gets difficult for companies to maintain a high productivity per person as they grow, because companies initially improve productivity per person due to specialization of labor, and then productivity per person tends to decline as companies get beyond a certain scale due to communication issues. So we do our best at SpaceX to minimize communication issues and have anyone-to-anyone communication, not instead of, say, chain of command communication, which is extremely inefficient. I think we're a little lower on productivity per person, although, like I said, we're trying to fix that. But since we have a lot more people, our total productivity and pace of innovation is faster than it has ever been.
Sir?
Frank Mooring with Aviation Week.
I know.
You mentioned this morning that you're thinking about taking SpaceX public toward the end of next year, possibly, but that you'd like to retain a personal controlling interest in it because of some things that you want to do. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about those personal objectives that would entice you to keeping a controlling interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's really what I want SpaceX to keep doing is working on the technologies necessary to create a self-sustaining civilization on Mars. while I do think there's likely to be some, economic payoff by transporting large numbers of people and cargo to Mars, it requires a bit of long-term thinking. So that maybe goes beyond the quarterly cycle of Wall Street, that's for sure. So some people in Wall Street will think that's just crazy, and what I should actually just do is milk the government and various commercial companies and try to charge them the highest price as possible, which we will not do. I want to make sure that I can ignore such things, and which I can only do if I'm kind of the controlling shareholder.
Can I just piggyback on that with a Washington question? I mean, the mood in Washington is a bit grim. We've got a lot on our plate. Where there's a lot of discussion of unaffordability. We're going week to week with continuing resolutions. And the long-term discussion is about what's going to happen to this country if we can't change the trajectory of debt.
Right.
No one's talking about new things to spend a lot of money on.
Right.
What advice or what message would you give to the Congress and the executive branch in this sort of tough time that everyone's slogging through with a very short-term focus? What would you say to them as someone who is really operating against a different vision and a different sort of time cycle?
Well, I think first of all, people ought to have some sense of perspective and realize that things are actually really freaking great. It's like the United States is actually doing quite well, and we all live really great lives here in the U.S. and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And the U.S. Is still the world's largest manufacturer and has been since it took over from England, 100 and some odd years ago. The unemployment rate is decreasing. I think there's lots of reasons to be positive, actually, without being complacent. We certainly need to decrease the amount of government spending. I think that's really important. That there seems to be some movement afoot to reining government spending, and it can't be like a little bit here around the edges. That doesn't count. There needs to be a meaningful decrease in government spending such that we do not have trillion-dollar deficits, because that's obviously unsustainable. And that's the trillion-dollar deficit thing. I liken to the sort of it's like toddlers with a cupcake. If you've ever seen these sort of delayed gratification tests, where you can apparently you can predict somebody's future success by the degree to which they can engage in delayed gratification. Where if you say, "Here's this cupcake; it's on a table. If you eat it now, that's all you get. But if you wait 10 minutes, you can have 3 cupcakes." And some toddlers they just go and they eat that cupcake, and they basically sacrifice tomorrow for today, effectively. That's kind of like what Congress often behaves like. And to some degree, the American people are responsible for this, because we ought to vote people out who engage in such behavior. Mm-hmm. Running trillion-dollar plus deficits, well, that chicken is going to, that is going to come back to haunt us like there's no tomorrow. We do not want to be Greece or Portugal or any such country. So we must make the hard decisions of reining in government spending and probably increasing the tax burden as well. But we need to do both. We can't solve it either by simply increasing taxes or by just cutting deficit. That's like saying, the sky is blue. It's so freaking obvious. And so I think hopefully we can Congress can display sufficient maturity and fortitude to make the right decision in this regard. And I'd applaud, for example, the UK is taking the appropriate austerity measures and cutting 25% of spending and that kind of thing. We have to do that here, and it's just going to get harder and harder if we don't do it soon, because our interest burden is going to the amount of money we spend on interest is going to start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's going to make that austerity even worse down the road.
Well, I must say that for all of the debate about how to spend less in Washington, we now know after an hour of conversation that there are people out there who are are pursuing a long-range vision that points to a lot of interesting and more sustainable and brighter vistas. And so on behalf of the Stimson Center, I'd like to thank you very much for being my guest on the Chairman's Forum. It's been wonderful to have you. Thank you, Mr. Musk.
Well, thanks for having me.
Have a nice day.